Welcome to episode 3 of Art and Faith, Faith and Art. And this episode is entitled St. Matthew. So I'm going to show you a portrait of St. Matthew from the early 9th century. And it's an instance of what we call Carolingian art. So I'll lay all that out for you in a few minutes. First of all, just a little bit of sort of background and context about the content and kind of methodology of these lectures. If you haven't figured it out yet, you will soon realize that my love and interest is in early Christian and medieval art. Might talk about a few things that are outside of those categories later on, but for now we're pretty much stuck in the early centuries of the Christian era. And we're looking at the kind of repertoire of Christian art, which is a very kind of rich repertoire. And we'll look at works of art in different media. So, for example, in the first lecture, we looked at a sarcophagus that was a piece of marble. Last episode, we looked at an ivory carving from a walrus tusk. And today, we'll look at a painting on a sheet of vellum, which is a kind of prepared sheet from either a sheep or a cattle. So different media, marble, ivory, vellum painting, and we'll see more later on. Perhaps we'll see some mosaics, we'll see some relief carvings in limestone, we'll see freestanding statues made of wood, if we get that far, whatever. So different media. And also we have different epochs. So the first episode was a marble sarcophagus found in the catacombs of Rome in the 4th century. And then we looked at a walrus tusk from the British Isles in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom from the 11th century. And today we'll look at a painting from the kind of Carolingian period in the kind of 9th century. So it's interesting. We get to see how the truths of our faith are embedded in the material culture of a particular epoch and expressed therein using the different kind of materials that were available to the artist. And we also see works of art that serve different functions, that exist in different kind of contexts. So the sarcophagus we looked at was underground in the catacombs, and the context there was death and burial. And the art of the catacombs is meant to give some kind of Christian expression to the kind of reality of death, how Christians think about death, how Christians kind of handle death. And the ivory carving we looked was at the cover of a kind of gospel book, most probably, and the context there then becomes the liturgy of the Christian church. And today we have an author portrait, and this portrait is embedded in a book of the Gospels, and is in fact a portrait that's on one side of the page, and on the other side of the page begins the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew. So, in other words, we're looking at images from all kinds of different kind of points of view, and my kind of hope is that whatever the original context of these images is, and whatever the kind of meanings they bear in those contexts, having recognized all that, my aim is to let these images kind of live and breathe for us here and now, to let them kind of speak to us, to let them kind of escape their context and delight our eyes and play in our imagination and inform our own thinking about the Christian faith. So today I'm going to show you then a portrait of St. Matthew. And let me begin by showing you that portrait. There is the portrait. Let me get it a little bit. There we go. And there is the opposite page, which marks the beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel. And I'll talk about both of these in their own kind of context. Just excuse me for 1 second. Someone's trying to reach me. Okay. And first of all, this is from a book of the Gospel, a book that's called the Ebo Gospels. And Ebo was an archbishop, and he was an archbishop of the town of France in France, which I believe is kind of north of Paris. And this town was within the Carolingian Empire. So the Carolingian Empire is the empire founded by Charlemagne, who kind of was a great kind of military genius, a great kind of administrative genius, and also a man, if not himself, a man of learning and culture, a man who was very interested in supporting learning and culture. And the capital of Charlemagne's empire was in Aachen, which is in the town of Germany today. So basically we get a kind of political and cultural unit that's in the kind of north and west of Europe. So that's the kind of place where these works of art are found. And Charlemagne was a kind of great patron of the arts and great patron of the learning. So scholars talk about a kind of Carolingian Renaissance. So Charlemagne's, he was a great kind of builder. He built his own kind of palace, his own chapel in Aachen. He gathered around his court a number of scholars. You may have heard of Alcuin. There was a revival of interest in kind of classical learning. It was a time when classical manuscripts were being kind of collected and copied and translated and commented upon. And also it was a time, there was a kind of revival of the forms of Greek and Roman art. And Greek and Roman art, as I spoke in the previous lecture, excelled in a kind of realistic and naturalistic depiction of the human form, and this was so the artists in the Carolingian Empire were looking at these Greek and Roman models and trying to reproduce them in their own way. And I think what we have, what we have here, we have the author portrait of St. Matthew, and this is a very common device for manuscripts of the time. It was to have a book of the Gospels, and you have the 4 Gospels within it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And at the beginning of each Gospel, you would have a portrait of the author. And this portrait here is just an absolutely kind of stunning work of art. It's kind of intensely dramatic and intensely kind of meaningful or kind of theological. So let's look at some of the details of this. So you can see that there is a human form there. You can see Saint Matthew. You can kind of recognize the features of his body, the kind of legs, the torso, the arm beneath the garments, and there's a kind of a realistic depiction of his face, and yet strangely everything is in motion. Everything is kind of moving, and you can see up in the I believe it's the it's on the left-hand side of the image. You can see just up in the corner there, you can see a winged figure, which is an angel, who is unrolling kind of scroll. And this is a typical way of of depicting divine inspiration. So there in Christian art there are four. Each evangelist has his own symbol. So the symbol of St. John is the eagle, because his theology is thought to soar above the theology of all the other Gospels. The image for St. Luke is the ox, because he gives us the most detailed account of our Lord's infancy. And the image of St. Matthew is a man, or often a kind of winged man, because he gives us the human genealogy of Jesus Christ. And the image for Mark is a lion. And these four images are taken from the book of Revelation, and ultimately from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. But in the book of Revelation, when the Lamb appears in the throne, there are these four figures that surround him, which bow down to worship him. And the early Christians very soon, almost immediately, identify these four figures with the four evangelists. And I'll probably talk about the significance of that in a later lecture. So in this image of St. Matthew, you see the image of the winged kind of angel inspiring him. And the winged angel is very kind of small here, but he and I believe the winged figure is on not your left, but on your right. I often get confused about left and right. That's just one of my peculiarities. The winged angel is kind of small. It's kind of minor element in the picture, but he unleashes a great force into the world, and a force that kind of stirs up everything. So you can see the kind of force conveyed by the kind of lines, and by the great kind of the hair of St. Matthew is kind of flying wildly in the air, and his garments are all kind of ruffled and disturbed as if by a great wind and a kind of great force. So this kind of tells us that the Gospels come into the world as a kind of force, a force that disrupts everything, that overturns our accustomed categories of thinking, that lays down for us kind of new and important truths that we must take into account as we live our lives and try and inform build our cultures and build our civilization. The Gospels don't come into the world as a kind of neutral piece of information, as a kind of bald set of facts, but the Gospel comes into the world as a force. St. Paul said the Gospel is like a two-edged sword that cuts to the bone and to the marrow. And so I think this is what is conveyed in very kind of visual and dramatic terms in this image. The Gospel is a force. It is a kind of disruptive force that comes into the world. And what is kind of striking, one of the things that's striking about this image is the kind of look on St. Matthew's face, that you can see him there perched before his codex, and he has a look of kind of amazement on his eyes, a look of his eyes are it's as though his eyes are kind of wide open, because he's about to write a truth and to see that truth with his own eyes for the first time. So very kind of dramatic, very kind of expressive. And perhaps I should kind of back up a little bit and just say something about the book and about the codex. The book, as we know it, that is a kind of this kind of thing with kind of pages that you open up, came popular sometime around the year kind of 300. Before this time, books were written in kind of scrolls, and you would kind of scroll through the pages, and each scroll represented almost a kind of chapter of the book. And scrolls were made of papyrus, and something happened about the year 300 that caused a shift from the scroll to the book. And one kind of theory is that this may have been as a result of the kind of structure of the Christian Bible, that the Christian Bible is a kind of unified whole, and the various parts of the Bible relate to one another. So the Old Testament is thought to be a foreshadowing, for example, that's fulfilled in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you get various types that are replayed in the New Testament. You get various prophecies that are fulfilled in the New Testament. So when a Christian reader, a Christian scholar is studying the Bible, he's reading one text, but he also needs to refer back to other texts or to refer forward to other texts, because his work as a theologian is to relate these texts to one another, to come up with some kind of a unified account of the whole. It's very difficult to do this practically. If you have a number of scrolls, you got to dig out one scroll, you got to scroll through it, find the relevant page, and then you have to put that down and pick up another scroll. So it becomes very kind of tedious. So a book is an ideal form for containing the kind of revelation of God that is kind of recorded for us in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in fact, it's recorded that Constantine, when he converted in the year 312, one of the things he did is he ordered, I believe, 50 copies of the Bible in book form. And book form is, it didn't really have paper as we know it, but the book was made of kind of vellum, which is taken from the skins of cattle or the skins of sheep. And it was very kind of elaborately prepared. It was scraped clean. It was kind of stretched. It was kind of cut. It was kind of bound together, a whole kind of process. And you can imagine that as a result of this, books also were very expensive. It took a great number of sheep to make a big book, so you had to have a kind of big flock there, and that's why books became kind of rare and expensive, almost kind of luxury items. We take it for granted. We're kind of so blessed. We, all our houses are filled with books of all kinds, and we can just pick up something. And if we don't, then can't pick it up, then we can research it on the internet and find exactly what we want. Well, it was very different conditions in the early church and in the Middle Ages. Books were rare and books were expensive.